deacon. I'm the Weinstein Rosenthal professor here, and by that right, your host for the evening, which I'm very proud to be. You're certainly welcomed to the University of Richmond campus. I know that we have individuals from the city, and we welcome you to this lecture this evening. As we meet here to hear Rabbi James Rudin, it's an interesting experience to get to know the various individuals that come to the campus to lecture. Some of those individuals are, by their nature, so warm and give a compassionate and caring air about them that you cannot help but respond in a very favorable way to them. Jim Rudin is one of those individuals. Jim is an individual who came into the Old Dominion when he was about 4 years of age, and that probably had a lot to do with that personality. But he grew up in Northern Virginia, and having finished that period in Northern Virginia, he did some work at Wesleyan University and then completed his baccalaureate at George Washington University. He went on from there for his Master of Arts and his rabbinical ordination at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. It is oftentimes noted that the promise that an individual seems to have as he goes through that period of academic training sometimes does not materialize in our adult lives. It is fortunate that that promise fully materialized with Jim Rudin. Jim held an assistant rabbinical post and then a rabbinical post both in the Midwest. And in 1968, he joined forces with the American Jewish Committee. He has been with them since that time, and he is currently the National Interreligious Affairs Committee Director. In that post, you oftentimes see his name in print. He will perhaps mention several of the items that have commanded his attention of recent years. He's an unusual individual in the eclectic nature of his interest and his productivity. He has been throughout his ministry a person who has been not only socially conscious but socially active. The Biafran disaster was one of the areas of his interest and contribution. Voting rights, apartheid, you name those major issues that have confronted us, and he has been there. At the same time, he has been a very productive scholar on an eclectic basis as well. He is an authority on religious cults. He has done a lot of work with the evangelical movement and its impact upon Judaism. I would commend to you a book that he, with his wife and a good friend, did, Why Me, Why Anyone, which is an excellent study on the understanding of the problem and the nature of evil and how that impacts us, especially when we think about the evil of disease racking a body. There's so much that could be said about Jim, but what I would rather do at this point is turn it over to him. He is going to speak to us on the topic, the Jewish and Christian stake in religious pluralism. Haven't heard it before, I waited anxiously again. Jim, welcome to the University of Richmond.
Frank, thank you very much for that overly long and very accurate introduction. I wish that my relatives about 100 miles north of here up I-95 in Alexandria and Falls Church in Arlington and McLean and a few other of those delicious communities that mean so much to me. We're here to dispute what you just said, but this being Richmond, they are not here, and so you were able to get away with it. I'm very honored in more ways than I can number to deliver this annual Weinstein Rosenthal lecture here at the University of Richmond. for Marcus and Carol and for Gil and Fanny. I think we are all in their debt for their foresight, their commitment, their imagination, and above all, their vision. What a university and what a lectureship, and the melding of the two of a great tradition, an academic tradition here at Richmond and a tradition of Christian and Jewish studies. So we owe those two families a great deal. And so for that reason, I was happy to come here, happy to see again my colleague and friend Frank Aiken, who I see at many, many workshops and at many interreligious meetings around the country. As I said, it gives me a chance also to come back to the state that whatever it did to me, it gave me my education from the 1st through the 12th grade, although Alexandria at that time didn't have an 8th grade, so I only went 11 years to public school in Virginia, so that may account for some of the shortcomings you're about to hear tonight. The system was a little poor at the time, and so you went 7 and 4. Some of you may remember those days. And then it gives me also a chance to do what I really want to do, talk about not subjects like the Auschwitz convent and my recent trip to Poland, which I'd be happy to talk about later, and the Vatican, but something much closer to home, the Jewish and Christian stake in religious pluralism. And what we're seeing tonight, by the way, here at the University of Richmond with the Weinstein Rosenthal lectureship is a form of religious pluralism, whether you recognize it or not. But this being an academic institution, I first want to give you a test. Now, this is a test that you will not be graded on, and I'm not going to collect the papers because I'm not going to give them out, but I want to throw out about 8 questions to you, and you can mentally, if you can remember the questions, answer them in your mind. And I think these 8 questions will start the process rolling. What do we mean by religious pluralism? And why in the world should Jews and Christians be at all worried about it in the United States? So question number 1, it's a, by the way, multiple choice, so it makes it easy. It's no essays involved. The religious right in America is 1, seeking the establishment of a Christian republic and constitutes a threat to Jewish security. Or B, the religious right is simply exercising its constitutional right by participating publicly in public policy questions. C, the religious right is actively seeking the conversion of Jews to Christianity. And then all of the above are true or none of the above is true. Second question, public school teachers should A, refrain from any mention of a particular religion or religious beliefs within the classroom. B, public school teachers should be permitted to teach about the role of religion in American history. C, public school teachers should teach such values as civility, love of liberty, respect for differences, fairness, integrity, without endorsing any religious tradition or beliefs. Or D, public school teachers should reflect the values of the religious majority of the school district in which they teach. All of the above are true or none of the above? C, or third question. Religious pluralism is one of America's greatest achievements. B, religious pluralism is an effective way to guarantee that no one religious group gains dominance over the others. C, religious pluralism is simply a convenient way to disguise the fact that religious diversity exists in this country, whether we like it or not. And D, religious pluralism is a basic theological tenet of both Christianity and Judaism. All of the above or none of the above? We're almost halfway through. The fourth question I would throw out to you. A person who has deeply felt religious views on public policy questions like abortion, prohibition of alcoholic beverages, Sabbath closing laws, public school prayer, I could give you 15 more issues. Person who has deeply felt religious views on public policy questions has the obligation to use every legal means available to make those views the law of the land. B, a person who has these deeply felt views religiously should not act upon them if the views are contrary to the values of the total society. Or C, such a person should modify those views when they conflict with the majority values of the general society. All of the above is true, none of the above is true. The fifth question is even more difficult. Jews and Christians should A, become even more assertive in the separation principle of church and state. Or B, Christians and Jews should recognize that the U.S. wasn't, isn't, and never will be a secular society, and we should make the necessary accommodation to ensure our religious groups' survival. Or C, we should not make the particular religious affiliation of a candidate a criterion for public office. I'm only going to vote for a Southern Baptist, I'm only going to vote for a Quaker, I'm only going to vote for a Jew, I'm only going to vote for a Presbyterian. Or D, we should select our coalition partners on public policy questions on the basis of their own religious values and convictions. And the last three questions are very easy. Religious leaders, especially those who are priests, ministers, rabbis, bishops, pastors, are permitted to urge their flocks to vote for a particular candidate if the candidate's stated views corresponds to the religious leader's views. Or B, a religious leader must never speak out about public policy questions and should never endorse specific candidates during an election campaign. Or C, religious leaders themselves should never seek public office because of a possible conflict with the First Amendment, the non-establishment clause. Or D, religious leaders should be encouraged to express publicly their particular religious and moral insights on public policy issues. None of the above or all of the above is true. And the last two questions. American religious groups, in this case Christians and Jews, that aggressively express their beliefs have a unique role to play in the general society as custodians of moral and ethical values. Or B, American religious groups are just one of many, many competing interest groups who have no monopoly on ethics or morality or anything else, and they're just one more group that seeks to influence public policy. Or C, they have to be carefully contained, these religious groups, and muted and muzzled by means of strict church-state separation laws. And the one, especially for Virginians, that'll be most familiar, Jefferson's wall of separation between church and state is becoming weaker with increased public attention paid to religious groups, and religious groups becoming involved in the electoral process as never before. Or Jefferson's wall is becoming stronger as more and more Americans express concern about religion's growing presence in public policy debates. Or C, the wall of separation never existed in the first place and was merely a figment of Mr. Jefferson's imagination. Now, we do have, then, some serious work before us as Christians and Jews. What do I mean by the way, if you didn't answer all these questions, don't worry about it. You could take the Princeton Review or Stanley Kaplan in preparation. It wouldn't help you. None of these questions were deliberately meant to be easy. They're very complicated, as we'll soon see. But religious pluralism, from my perspective, and now I will not give out any more test questions, I'll speak in the first person, singular, is a positive good. But I assure you there are many of my fellow Jews and many Christians who don't see religious pluralism as good at all. But rather it's just diversity. It's just something that's happened in America and we have to live with it. I would see religious pluralism as a sign of God's will in the world. That after thousands of years of Jews and Christians struggling with one another, we're both here tonight at the University of Richmond. We are not going to convert each other out of existence, and surely perhaps that might be a sign of God's will. Why has pluralism flourished in America? Well, because the Europeans who came to this society at the beginning were Roman Catholics and Quakers and Jews who came to Rhode Island because that was where it was a free and open society, and to New Amsterdam. And Lutherans came here, and Baptists to Georgia, and Puritans, who were certainly not religious pluralists, came to Massachusetts, and the Anglicans came in large numbers to this state, and Dutch Reform came to New Jersey and New York, Presbyterians and Methodists, and so on and so forth. What we had then was, although each group wanted to be the majority culture, I think, and the dominant state religion, nobody had the votes. And you see that in the early history of America. But it wasn't easy. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, in this state had an Anglican education which he abhorred, and his biographers are very clear to mention it was because of that Anglican education that he was so insistent on the statute of religious liberty in Virginia. In Massachusetts, need I add, Puritans were not exactly among the forefront in religious pluralism. Ask Roger Williams and ask others about it. What I'm suggesting is that in October 1989, religious pluralism as we practice it in America, and I'll have more to say about it, is not the norm throughout the rest of the world. Whether you go to Northern Ireland, or to Lebanon, or to Iran, or to the Philippine Islands, where I served for a while as an Air Force chaplain, where Muslims and Christians continually are killing one another, or to India, where Hindus and Muslims are engaged in battles, or to Gaddafi's Libya, or to a host of other places in the world, religious pluralism is simply not the norm. Indeed, one can even go just north of here to the province of Quebec and still feel the tension between English-speaking Anglicans and French-speaking Roman Catholics. Now, in this country, we've had as we call it in the north, where I live now, a civil war. It's still called the war between the states down here. But that war was not over religion, it was over other issues. Indeed, the Presbyterian Church and the Baptists split at that time into northern and southern versions. It was not a war then along religious lines, it was along something else. And we've had, thank God I might say, no religious political parties in this country. No Christian Democrats, and from an Israeli perspective, no national religious parties as well. The two major parties, whatever they are not particularly known to be following doctrines of any one religious group. Indeed, their whole ethical basis may be questioned, which is for another night's discussion. But we are not in a land of political parties based along religious lines. Now, the result of all that I've said, I think we should take some pride in, because any of us who've traveled throughout the world recognize that in America, in the United States, we have the most vigorous, vital, and voluntary religious communities anywhere in the world that I know of. I remind myself of the established church in Sweden, rather dormant. The Church of England, although people may not like to believe it, it's also rather dormant. Indeed, one may put other adjectives to it. And even in my beloved Israel, there are struggles to find alternative expressions of Judaism beyond the orthodoxy, which is the quasi-established group there. What we then have, because religion is voluntary here, because it is vital and because it is vigorous, is a proliferation of religious groups of all kinds. To put it in merchandising, or indeed in the business world, religion after 1789 was deregulated by the First Amendment. And you know, in a deregulated society, all kinds of groups appear, good, bad, and indifferent, but that's the price we pay. The First Amendment really released religion then from the state and said to all the religious groups, you can go ahead and do whatever you want within reason, but we will not pick out one religious group and say that's the state religion, that's the religion of America, or that's the religion of the United States, or this is the government religion. It's deregulated, and let many flowers grow, and indeed that's what happened. But we cannot rest in 1989 on the laurels of our fellow Virginians, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Mason and the others. Every generation of Christians and Jews in this society has to grapple with religious pluralism and say, what does it mean to me and to our children and our children's children? What does religious pluralism mean in 1989, not 1789? And it's a very difficult and a painful question, because it seems to me neither Judaism nor Christianity at its heart is very pluralistic. When religions claim we have the truth and not a truth, when religions say that it is the way and not a way to God, when the emphasis is on the definite article and not the indefinite, when people say, I have the full expression of the divine here on earth and not an expression of the divine on earth, then we are not being rather pluralistic. And what we need to develop, and it will take very hard work by our theologians, is a theology of pluralism for Judaism and Christianity, and for Islam, and for Hinduism, and Buddhism as well. At lunch today I said that if you want to see the America of the 21st century, the kind of population we are going to become, go to Los Angeles, California. I recently addressed the Interreligious Council of Southern California, and generally when we say interreligious, we mean Christians and Jews, but not in Southern California. Southern California's Interreligious Council has at least nine that I counted the day I spoke, 9 separate religious traditions represented. They're all Americans, they're all American citizens. For the politicians present, they all vote, and their children will all vote. All kinds of Jews were represented in LA, all kinds of Christians. Muslims were there, Hindus were there, Buddhists were there, Sikhs were there, Baha'is were there, and a host of a few more. That is the emerging new America that will be the 21st century. That will be the new religious pluralism de facto, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not. That will be the America that will be there before us. And what I worry about a great deal is those of us who remember World War II, those of us who lived in the expanding and expansive American economic climate following World War II, which opened up to us, particularly if we were white and we were male. That America, when we shuffle off this mortal coil, will only be a memory to the next generation into the 21st century. The Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Sikhs, the Baha'is, the Confucianists, and the host of others. Will the tender plant that Jefferson and Mason and Madison envisioned, I believe, that plant of religious liberty, of religious pluralism, will it survive a new generation, a new group, a new economic, perhaps, time, when the American system will not be as expansive and as enriching and as enlarging as it was and is now? And then we have a proliferation of religious groups on the American scene that are loosely called, for want of a better word, the religious right, with whom I work and argue and debate and engage in encounters every day. These are people, some of whom, not all by any means, who would like to impose their own religious faith and value system on the total society. They would, and I pressed them very hard late at night, they would really like to establish, put it in quotes, one particular tradition as the sole, I'm quoting now, the sole legitimate religious expression for America. They say to me, Jim, there must be one religious tradition that is uniquely, solely, and legitimately American. There can be others in this society, but there must be one that gets special treatment. Now, these efforts have been unsuccessful, and they've often been coercive in a community. And it seems to me there have even been attempts to undermine the constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. But Americans are a religious people, and we are not neutral in matters of faith. This is not a secular society. Therefore, I think we have to develop a balance, we Jews and Christians at least, the balance between individual religious values and and the overall rights of the entire society. The population of America, as I've just pointed out, is becoming more multi-religious, more multi-ethnic, and more multiracial with each passing year. And religion, unfortunately, in some quarters is becoming a divisive force in the public policy debates. If left unexamined and uncritiqued, the current situation could erupt into a series of ugly confrontations resulting in a highly polarized society. If you want to rip a community apart, all you have to do is go to a public school, a school board meeting, and introduce the idea, values, how to put values in the public school, how to have a community agree on values for their children. That has torn apart more communities than anything else that I've seen. What values do we represent? Who shall represent them? How shall they be taught? Can they be taught without linking it to Christianity or Judaism or another faith? Should we have values in the public schools specifically spelled out? How can we achieve values? How can we form those values? Who should form them? Who should write the Bill of Particulars and so on? And this is what is happening in one community after another. Now, I think we have to take a stand, and I want to talk about some general principles. I think the unique contribution that we have in America is that we have religious pluralism based on religious liberty. In 1802, a Virginian, President Thomas Jefferson, wrote, "Believing that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the American people which declared that their legislature shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Jefferson's referring to the First Amendment. Thus, Jefferson said, creating a wall of separation between church and state. I think Jews and Christians have to be strong advocates of the twin provisions of the First Amendment. Free exercise of religion, deregulated, but at the same time, no establishment of one religion over the other as the national faith, as the established church, as the established religion. Religious pluralism has long been a fact of American life, but it's always been questioned as a value. I believe, as I said, that religious pluralism is a positive good, not grudgingly accepted because, well, I've got a Baptist living next to me on this side of my house, and a Methodist over here, and a Catholic over there, and a Quaker down there, and I don't like them, but they live on my block, so that's pluralism. That's not what I mean by pluralism. Pluralism is something positive and something good, because pluralism challenges religious communities to view with respect and understanding those who don't share our own particular religious expression. And I would submit that pluralism is a safeguard against the potential tyranny of the religious majority. And I would suggest to Christians and Jews to read our histories to know what happens when the religious majority gains control of the engines of the state. And then you have a tyranny that the history books are replete with. James Madison, when he wrote the Federalist Papers, understood exactly what was going to happen in America. In Federalist Paper number 51, he has this wonderful sentence. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. Madison said, in one case there's a multiplicity of interests, that's civil rights, and in the other there will be a multiplicity of sects, S-E-C-T-S. Madison knew that it wasn't just going to be Anglicans, or Baptists, or Presbyterians, or Quakers, or Lutherans, or Catholics, or even Jews who were going to be the dominant force in American society. There would be a multiplicity of religious groups. The genius of America has been up till now the ability to take these groups to encourage full religious expression and communities without any one group being able to impose its religious views on the entire society. Now, there have been some disastrous attempts. There was the attempt of the prohibition of alcoholic beverages in this society in the 20th century. It was a total failure. That, to me, was the imposition of a particular religious community, the Dries, to impose their views on the total society. The question, however, doesn't go away so easily. What if I believe in my heart of hearts, as a religiously committed person, that every part of American society should shut down from Friday night to Saturday night because it's my Sabbath, and because one of the 10 Commandments is, you shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and no places of entertainment should be open, and no stores, and no sporting events. In other words, the Sunday Blue Law is only translated to Saturday, from Friday night to Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. And I believe this so strongly that it would be such a great thing for the whole American society that I'm going to do everything I can to make it the law of the land. I'm going to get petitions. I'm going to judge candidates on whether they're in favor of Saturday closing laws. I'm going to bring suits. I'm going to do everything I can. Now the question is, at what point does my individual, deeply felt religious views, and of course I'm using a rather tame one. If I used abortion, I think we would get closer to the problem. But let's stay with Sabbath closing, because that's relatively easy to be cool about. But I'm going to press this law as hard as I can, because I believe it not on constitutional grounds, but on religious grounds. And that's what America should have, a law that closes everything down from Friday night to Saturday night, and that's my religious belief. At what point does Jim Rudin's private, individual, religious belief stop and the good of the general society start? Or do I have the right, and nay, do I have the obligation in our pluralistic society to work forever to bring my own deeply held religious views into the law of the land? It's a question we can talk about in the question and answer, and abortion, and Bible reading, and value formation in public schools, what books we will let our children read, and a host of other issues take on those views, because that's where the tire hits the road in American pluralism. The individual's deeply held religious views and the total American society. Now, one of the great things about American pluralism has been that we have not linked, at least most of us, America's political action with God's will. American servicemen, at least the ones I saw in the Air Force, did not have on their belts what the Kaiser's army had in World War I, which said, God is with us. We don't at least lend religious support to nationalist enthusiasm, who should not, and pity the religious leader who blesses nationalist enthusiasms, whether it's a war or a campaign or anything like that. We do believe that the values held by America's religious groups have had a formative role in shaping the moral and ethical and social and political values of our society. Religion and society, if we look at it closely, are not enemies locked in conflict. And a society is not a blank tablet waiting for a particular religious truth or truths to be inscribed upon it. There is an interaction, and that's what I've been saying tonight, between religious views and the general society. And every generation has to redefine that wall of separation that Mr. Jefferson talked about. How high should the wall be? Are there gates in the wall? Are there doors? Can you climb over the wall? And should we have a wall of separation at all? Let me try to conclude some of these remarks with some specific recommendations, and I'll make them quite brief. I believe, first of all, that public schools must provide education for responsible and moral citizenship. The concepts I believe public schools should teach would be civility, pluralism, integrity, fairness, the responsibility of society, and the sovereignty of the people. And you think that sovereignty of the people is just a line. Let me share with you two things that happened, one nationally and one to me personally. All of us remember the Iran-Contra affair, where one of the leading figures, an unnamed Marine officer, seemed to forget the sovereignty of the people when he talked about his commander-in-chief was the sovereign for him, and indeed was in some ways higher than the Constitution. This way lies disaster. This way lies an enormous amount of disaster. I was on the Camp David committee to build an interreligious chapel up in the mountains of Maryland, and we have some people there who think that the president owns Camp David. And I had to remind this pastor, and wasn't alone, several others reminded, that Camp David doesn't belong to the president. The president belongs to us. Camp David belongs to us. It is the sovereignty of the people. And we forget that. And I think that's extremely important, and it's the job of public schools to teach that. I, however, believe that public schools in a pluralistic society should not inculcate the elements of a particular religious faith or tradition in their students. Nor should public schools, which have enough burdens on them, endorse the theological beliefs of one group, even if that one group constitutes the majority of a school district. Which means that if one goes to a school district in a part of the United States where the overwhelming majority of the students are Jews, that doesn't mean that that school district has to reflect Judaism in the schoolroom, or Mormonism in Utah, or Roman Catholicism in Rhode Island, or any other areas where you have one group constituting the majority of a school district. I also believe that public schools should not teach specific doctrines to their students. There should not be any mandated public prayer in the schools. But here is where I differ with the classic church-state separationist. I do believe in a pluralistic society that public schools should teach about the role of religion in American history. How can a student learn about American history without a knowledge of the role that religious groups have played in shaping that history? Nor is it possible to understand contemporary American society without understanding its religious components. The absence from the public schools of any story of religions in America fails to appreciate the full dimensions of religious liberty and religious pluralism. How can you talk about America without talking about the role that Harriet Beecher Stowe, a minister's wife, played in the abolition movement? How can you talk about a movement that many of us were directly involved in, the civil rights movement, without mentioning that Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Joshua Heschel, one was a Protestant minister and one was a rabbi. They weren't just civil rights leaders, Dr. King and Dr. Heschel. They were a little bit more than that. And to simply say that they were civil rights leaders without talking about the religious force which moved them into the civil rights struggle, or the religious commitment that Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you can go with a lot of other people, brought to the American scene, I think misses the point for our students. Teaching about the role of religion in American history is not the same as specific doctrines. American independence, let's never forget, was preached in colonial pulpits, churches, and synagogues. The battles for abolition, I think it was the wrong battle, but nonetheless, for prohibition and abolition, civil rights, sexual equality, the environment, war and peace, and the other great social and political issues are being waged and were waged and raged by religious communities. The current fevered debate over abortion on both sides is bringing to bear religious communities in ways that are often not fully appreciated. And let me conclude with a most controversial point. The Constitution specifically prohibits any religious test for national public office. Read Article 6. Nevertheless, I think we would all agree that there are de facto religious tests which choose candidates on the basis of religious affiliation. I think we Jews and Christians in a religiously pluralistic society should reject any kind of religious test or requirement for public offices, whether de jure or de facto. And any attempt by a candidate, as they often do, to polarize the electorate along lines of religious preference or theological doctrine, as we saw sometimes in 1988, must be rejected. But is it permissible for a rabbi, a cardinal, a pastor, a minister, a preacher, who is responsible to a specific constituency to urge that community to vote for that candidate based on the candidate's particular religious affiliation? In recent times, such instructions by some religious leaders have become very public and very dramatic, especially in my state. This is where I now live, New York, this is a highly controversial issue. I believe religious leaders are well within their rights in a pluralistic society to influence the political behavior of their constituency. But I don't think it's very wise or very prudent. And I strongly believe that religious leaders best serve themselves by refraining from taking stands in the pulpit for one particular candidate during an election. This, then, are some of the issues that religious pluralism raises for our society. They are filled with potential danger. But I, like many of you, was raised in Virginia, and I especially cherish the political philosophies of Jefferson, as you must gather, and Madison and George Mason. The teachings of these very great early Virginia leaders call for religious liberty for all citizens, a separation of religion and state, and a keen awareness that the American society's protection of religious rights must be the same as that for civil rights. Because of Virginia's very unique history, its citizens, it seems to me, have a special responsibility to safeguard religious pluralism from those who would weaken it. After more than 200 years, religious pluralism, for me at least, remains the best means of preserving religious freedom for all, at a time, as I said, when the population of the United States is becoming more multi-religious, more multi-ethnic, and more multiracial. If we do not cherish religious pluralism and work to see that it's going to survive into the next generation, we could become like other nations in the world, where one's religious identity becomes a political statement, where one's religious identity becomes a source of warfare and political intrigue and political manipulation, and indeed warfare. History, I am sure, will judge us very harshly if we, who are the children of the George Masons and the James Madisons and the Thomas Jeffersons of this state, history will judge us very harshly if we as Christians and Jews fail to meet today's threat to religious pluralism. I assure you the threat is there, and I call upon you to respond to it in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know you have many questions in your mind derived from the remarks that you have heard. What I'm going to ask you to do is to raise your hand or something of that nature so that Jim can acknowledge you, and I will ask him to just field your questions rather than an intermediary.
Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, in these conversations with the religious right, if you feel that you are getting in it well.
Yes, I'll tell you why. Well, let me be very candid. I think the collapse of Pat Robertson's candidacy in his own party was very revealing. You can put your own editorial comment on it. I think also that the religious right, and that's a term I could define for you in a little more precision if you want, have begun to find out that accommodation is not necessarily a dirty word, that America is made up of not all like-minded people, but a pluralism of, as I've tried to indicate, of groups. And Los Angeles is a perfect example. And I didn't even get into the ethnic differences of Hispanics and Orientals. I mean, you can start differentiating. But the religious right is beginning to find out that it is not so simple to get yourself elected and to have impact when you have to appeal to a general electorate. I mean, it's one thing you've got purity of vision and you know the truth. It's another thing when people have to vote on your view of the truth or you have to adjust to it. I think, however, we should not underestimate that the battle is still taking place. I mean, Pat Robertson may not have been successful, and Jerry Falwell may have closed down his moral majority, and as I understand, has gone back to Lynchburg basically full time. The big battles, and I just indicated one of them in my prepared remarks, the big battles, if you want to see where the battles in America are really taking place, forget the presidential level. That's the glamour level every 4 years. Forget even the House of Representatives. Go to 3 areas. Go to school boards, go to library boards, and go to human relations commissions in cities. and see how communities try to grapple with the purchase of new books in the library. Should they get book A, B, or C? I can name the books, and this rips communities apart. And the religious right will say you can't read this book, or this book, and then people on the left will say yes, we want this book and this book and this book, and communities are torn apart. I indicated value formation is the one certain thing that will tear a community apart. Can you imagine sitting down in a school board and writing a platform of values for a public school system? It's an enormous question, but in answer to your question, I think the religious right has begun to realize that there are other people in this society, and that it's not so simple, and that when you have a continental power of over 240 million Americans, there's a lot more to it than just a few proclamations. And I would say that the rough edges on some of them who are serious, I mean, if you're really serious about running for office, are beginning to find out that the other person is not necessarily the enemy. So I'm somewhat optimistic. America's genius has been to take all varying groups, not homogenize them, but as I said, that tension between your individual right and the general right. By the way, I didn't answer the question about that, about how if I want to shut down every piece of American business for the Sabbath, do I have a right to just try to do that, or should I give it up after a while? I'd be interested in your views. Yes, sir.
Do you perceive pluralism being weakened by the development of the religious educational system?
I don't think so. You're talking about parochial schools or day schools? No. I think that's part of the pluralism. I think even however you argue it, I think that enriches it. And in pluralism, as I would describe it, it provides alternatives for parents who want a different kind of education for their child. Now, we may not always like some of the alternatives, but that's the price you pay in this vigorous, voluntary, deregulated religious society. Now, these schools have to meet certain requirements, allegedly. The cults do not, by the way. The Unification Church, for instance, has been running schools that don't meet sanitation and don't meet... But you're assuming schools meet all these state requirements. I don't see that as a deterrent to religious pluralism. I think it enriches. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could distinguish for us between the evangelicals and the far right. And then doing such, do you think it's antithetical to both or either movement for them to someday maybe encompass religious pluralism, or would it be diverse to their very group?
Well, the religious right is not necessarily the evangelical community, not at all. Religious right can also be Roman Catholics, it can be Jews, it can be in the religious right, some of them are. It can be people of no religious persuasion per se, but you're asking whether they will be brought into the system, did you say?
In their beliefs, can they encompass religious pluralism?
Well, let me tell you the secret. I'm sure many of you know this. The so-called religious right took their lead from the so-called religious left. They watched how clergy and laity concerned about the Vietnam War operated. A group that maybe Frank is familiar with. That was in the 60s. That they watched how social action committees of Christian and Jewish bodies gave grades to politicians for their stand on issues that would be considered left of center political issues. And I've sat in on a lot of the religious right meetings, and they said, we see what others are doing, we have a right to do it. And here, coming to the University of Richmond in the South, I mean, far be it from me to mention that for many of them, they saw their evangelical feelings as a rather individual relationship between themselves and God. It's only been in the last, 10 or 15 years that they've suddenly begun to say, there's also a society out there that I should address with my evangelical commitments as well. They saw Roman Catholics, liberal Protestants, Jews, Quakers, all out there in the political realm, and so it seems to me they have as much right to engage in public policy questions as the American Friends Service Committee, as the Social Action Commission, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, as the Board of Missions, the National Council of Churches, or as the U.S. Catholic Conference. The question is, coming into this stew of religious pluralism, and it's very complicated religious pluralism, are they going to be able to take their defeats, their political defeats, like everybody else does? Because you can't win all your battles politically, not in a diverse country like America. You can't get every issue that you want passed. It just isn't going to happen. The other thing that's of interest to me is, will the so-called religious right, and I call them the religious right, will they be able to enter into coalitions with others who maybe don't share their view on every issue, but on the one issue that they're working on, go along? One of the things we learn about, the Jews have learned about political coalitions. I think women have learned it. I think blacks have learned it. I think Hispanics are learning it. No one group can go alone politically. You can't get your agenda through by yourself. You need coalition partners. But a coalition, to me, doesn't mean a congruence of religious views. I mean, we work with Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals on a host of issues in the Jewish community. That doesn't mean I stop being a Jew or they stop being a Christian. Well, can the religious right go along with people who maybe don't share their views religiously, but might have the same attitude on a couple of issues? That's a real question. If the religious right doesn't want to enter into coalitions, then they're going to be doomed, because the numbers aren't out there for them to pass legislation and to elect large numbers of political figures. I think we know that, and I think they know that. Yes, sir, way in the back.
Rabbi, the abortion issue now is a political issue since the Webster decision. Is there any way that a rabbi or a minister or a priest can speak on that issue from the pulpit without becoming involved in politics?
Well, I think I've indicated by the way I pegged my test questions that I think it's not correct that the religious community or religious leaders are not correct. Why should a religious leader step back from the abortion issue, or the prayer in the public school issue, or whether Huckleberry Finn should be on the bookshelf or not, or the Diary of Anne Frank? And these are two books that are very much in contention for obvious, well, maybe not so obvious reasons. So I would think that to ask a religious leader to eschew is a fancy word, to not participate in the public policy debate is taking that person's citizenship, diminishing it. So I don't see any problem with religious leaders speaking out, whether it's abortion or anything else. The question is, do they have a right to stand up on a pulpit and say, I want candidate A, B, and C because of the abortion issue? That's what happened in our state in 1984 during the presidential election. Or I want candidate X, Y, and Z using the full power of the synagogue or the church. And I don't think that they have a right to do that. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
I would raise the question academically for the professors. Should professors during an election year wear campaign buttons in the classroom when they're teaching students? Yet they have a right to do that. And clearly a rabbi has the right to say, I want Ms. A or Mr. B, and say it to my congregation on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. I have a right to do that. I said I don't think it's wise or prudent. I would also suggest I don't think it's wise or prudent for people to wear campaign buttons on company time, so to say, in public schools, or maybe at the university might be different. I'm not sure. So that's what I'm saying. That there are limits you draw to your rights, I suppose.
Sir, if I could just ask one
Sure.
more question. Since it's a political issue, the candidates are staking out positions on it. And for that reason, I asked the question, can the religious leader speak on the issue without seeming to become involved in those candidates' positions?
It's difficult. You phrase it very nicely. I'd be a little more blunt. It's not can they take a stand. I think they do have to take a stand on the most fevered issue that's before us, which is obviously right now is abortion. Unless for some reason the religious leader doesn't have a view on it, which is also unlikely but possible. If you can say I'm pro-choice or I'm anti-choice and even how you phrase the words is a political statement. And and there's just no way to get around it. And I'm afraid we are with this fevered issue for a long time to come. But for the religious community to step back, or part of the religious community to step back, I assure you there are others who will step forward and fill that void. And I think what makes American pluralism work is not to have voids, but you have a robust debate. You get everybody into the act. You get the religious right, you get the liberal Protestants, you get the Jewish community, you get the Muslim community, you get the Catholic community, you get everybody into it. That's what we do. It's worked so far pretty well. The question I raise is, can it continue to work with new groups coming in and new issues before us? I'll make my answers much shorter. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Would you mind if I made a comment rather than ask a question?
Sure.
And ask you to respond to my comment. I don't want to disagree. I don't think with anything you said, but I do feel like your remarks are somewhat incomplete. And I want to add to them and see what you think about what I have to say. You have stressed that the threat to religious pluralism comes from religious groups in this country. One of the things that's very interesting to me in the history of Western thought is that some of the most ardent proponents of an established religion and opponents of religious freedom were atheists. And specifically, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau were all either atheists or certainly agnostics. And one can also go back and look at Plato and Aristotle, who were both in favor of established religion. And certainly they weren't either Christians or Jews. Why did those people, even though they were opposed to religion, actually favor an establishment of religion? And the answer is the answer that most modern sociologists would give, and that is that every stable political society needs to have some sort of core of common beliefs and values in order for it to exist. So that they thought, rightly or wrongly, they thought that it was important to have an established religion in order to provide that core of common values. Now, I say that because it seems to me that even though we might be in favor, 100% in favor of religious freedom, we ought to recognize that there are political reasons, not religious reasons, but there are political reasons here for having something like an established religion. And if you don't have it, then you run the risk of society breaking up. And if you look at our own society, I think you have to say today that we might very well be on the verge of breaking up. You can compliment America for a lot of things, but the fact of the matter is America has more crime than any other nation by far. And that doesn't sound like a well-organized stable society. So my point is, it seems to me that those of us who are defenders of religious freedom and religious pluralism, at the same time we defend that, it seems to me we have to admit that there is a potential political problem here, and that we have a responsibility to try and address that problem in some way or the other, because it's not just, it's not just all on one side.
No, you raise, I think, very well some of the questions. For instance, you're right. The way I delivered this address, maybe from the vineyard I work in, sometimes seem like a jungle, but the vineyard I work in, much of the threat that I deal with does come from the religious community. However, let me state it outwardly that I am in a clash between a state and religion. I'm much more worried about the future of religion. The state will always exist. Put it bluntly, the eagle, the American eagle, will always be here. The cross and the Star of David could be in danger. In other words, I think the state is in no danger in this society, from religion. I think religion is some danger from the state. In other societies, it's maybe the other way around. I think we saw the, you see, the American history up to now, we've never had the government. I mean, we get tax incentives for giving money to religious charities, but the state has never sought, at least in my reading of American history, to try to control and manipulate religions. It's sometimes very unhappy with stands during the Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement, or I know the Reagan administration was not happy with the Catholic bishop's statement on war and peace. But we've never had such as where we've had examples in Europe where the state has tried to organize its own alternative religious community. I'm thinking of the Nazi period, where Hitler had his Deutsche Christen, his own Nazi church, which was a parallel to authentic Christianity. So I don't think religion in America has much to fear so far from the American state. And certainly the American state's existence hasn't much to fear from the religious community here. In fact, I wish the religious community would be a little more critical of the state in its behavior. Now, the question you raised, though, is I think the need for a central core value, a set of shared values in a time of drugs and crime and all the things that we certainly know go on just outside this campus. The question would be, is America capable of now? I suggested some of those shared values in a public school curriculum. They were necessarily vague: civility, love of country, sovereignty of the people, rule of the courts. But is that enough? That's the question. To carry through the established order through this very, very turbulent time. And one of the things I didn't mention tonight, which is for another discussion, I guess, is the whole role of civil religion in America, which is a kind of substitute sometimes for Judaism or Christianity. And that would take us, I think, maybe too far afield. So I think you're right. I think that I would say until recently, Americans probably had a shared sense of value that didn't need to be spelled out particularly. We may be at a time now where the Constitution is not enough, for that there has to be something more spelled out. And yet every time Americans have tried to sit down and write these shared values, chaos breaks out. Maybe it's a result of pluralism, or maybe despite pluralism. I'll give you just one example. I was involved some years ago on the White House conference on the family. I don't know if some of you were involved in that conference. Well, you could not even get people to agree on the definition of a family. So it became the White House Conference on Families, because you can have one person constitutes a family. Really, homosexual families, heterosexual families, single parent, double parent. I mean, you get on and on and on. So it starts out as a, quote, value, the family, becomes a battleground just to define what is meant by families, much less even get into a definition of whether that family value is worth preserving. And it was a brutal fight just on the definition of family. So I think if you want an example, get your students, if one is a professor here at University of Richmond, to ask them to write down what are shared values that Americans of all faiths and no faiths should have. And I think you would be shocked, probably, with what comes out. And it would be very difficult to get them to agree. So what I'm urging is, let's don't get into that. Let's try to go back to our earlier history and try to use that. And that's why I quote, obviously, 3 Virginians so heavily as a basis for shared values. But it may not be, you may be exactly right. It may not be sufficient. Yes, sir?
Talking about preserving religious pluralism, you said you got to have some religious pluralism.
Yeah.
As I have done. Pointed out to me when I was very young by a Christian theologian, Christianity has a huge stake in the survival of life of Judaism. We do not properly understand ourselves fully except in dialogue with Judaism. And not being a Jew, I don't know what much I can do about the survival of Judaism except to encourage young Jews to take it seriously. But I'm wondering what would be your vision of what will be the state in Israel, the religious state, say 25 or 50 years from now. Will there, other than the a resurgence of a Viking Judaism there, like American Judaism? What do you picture?
I hope so. I think so. I think these things go in pendulums. There will always be an Orthodox Christianity, always an Orthodox Judaism, always an Orthodox Islam. Orthodoxy will always, however we define it, will always be with us. The question is, will there be alternative forms of Christianity, of Judaism, of Islam? Islam, I'm certainly not prepared to talk about at great length, but I think you need other people. But my hope for Israel would be that that there would be alternative expressions of Judaism, and not what you call hard right. By hard right, you mean extreme Orthodox, I suppose. It's very interesting that the early founders of Israel, the giants now, the David Ben-Gurions and the Golda Meirs and the early leaders, were never really, obviously not opposed to the Jewish religion, but wanted the Jewish religious tradition to fit into a larger civilization in Israel, the Zionist dream. And they always felt that the Jewish religious tradition carried Jews through the diaspora to reach the Jewish state. But I don't think, if you read Ben-Gurion closely and some of the others, that they wanted the Jewish religion, particularly Orthodox Judaism, to dominate the new state. And I think that's what we're talking about now. That's a very important subject to the Jewish community. What's the proper role of religion in the state of Israel? By the way, what's the proper role of religion in the United States is our subject too. I think we've seen some examples in Israel, we've seen some examples in America where the proper role has not been clearly defined, and that results in tremendous tensions and divisiveness. So I would hope that in 25 or 50 years that there would be a pluralism in Israel. It's going to be a different kind of pluralism than the United States. I mean, every country's different. You can't carry out what works in America to Mexico, to Ecuador, to Thailand, to Israel. It just doesn't work that way. But it has to be on an Israeli kind of pluralism, and I would hope it will emerge. It's difficult right now. There's a lot of divisiveness inside the Israeli society along the proper role of religion in society.